afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Digital Law Podcast, brought to you by Digital Law and produced by Anson Evaluate. As a bit of background, we at Digital Law are a niche law firm specialising and working solely in technology and cybersecurity law sector. In each episode, we look at recent stories in the news linked to digital technology from around the world, with a specific emphasis on data protection and cybersecurity. For more information on any specific stories that we mention in this episode, please check the links in our show notes. By way of an introduction, I'm Amelia Davies, an apprentice solicitor at Digital Law UK, and I'm joined by Ethan Anson, who's been completing some work experience with us, and Peter Wright. So I'll pass over to Ethan to introduce himself, and then Peter, I'll pass over to you.
Hi, my name's Ethan and I'm a third-year law student at the University of Sheffield, and I've been completing a week-long work experience with Digital Law.
Thanks, Ethan. Peter?
My name is Peter Wright. I'm a solicitor and the Managing Director at Digital Law, and looking forward to the discussion that we're having today with regards to the Online Safety Act. And Ethan is actually selling himself short there, because what he hasn't mentioned is that he was part of the winning team of a hackathon project that we worked on earlier this year, which was a fascinating exercise. And out of all the great teams and the wonderful sort of systems that they devised, it was Ethan's team that came up with the winning one, hence the work experience that he's done with us. But yeah, don't sell yourself short there, Ethan.
Thanks, Peter. So we will dive right into what we're going to cover today, and that is the Online Safety Act. So no doubt you have heard a lot in the news about this Online Safety Act. And firstly today, we're just going to cover kind of who introduced it, what it is, where it came about, and kind of what stages of implementation we're in and why. So firstly, who introduced it? So this is an act that was introduced by the UK government and Parliament, and it was first introduced in 2023. It essentially, in a nutshell, looks at giving Ofcom new powers, looking at technology and internet service providers, both UK and overseas companies offering user-to-user or search services in the UK specific obligations. It's thinking about campaigners who have wanted to get specific pieces of information within this act, and looking at affected users specifically within the UK with a main focus of children. So you might be asking, well, what actually is it? So the Online Safety Act was established in 2023, and it looks at the legal duties for online platforms to prevent and mitigate harmful content, particularly towards children. It introduces new criminal offences and grants Ofcom enforcement powers, including fines. It essentially brings in a high level of regulation. And this is a UK-based act, so it does apply across the whole of the UK, but it does have some extraterritorial reach for certain offences committed abroad by UK residents or companies. As I've mentioned, it was passed in 2023, but we are still seeing some effects here now in 2025. And so I will pass over to Ethan and Peter to give us some more background on this. Ethan.
Thank you. So the earliest mention of bringing in regulation for the internet I could find was David Cameron in 2013, and he said he wanted to cleanse the internet of disgusting material. And this led to the Internet Safety Strategy Green Paper in 2017. This proposed a voluntary social media code, a practice and industry, to raise awareness. Mainly, this was to protect citizens' rights and well-being online, and didn't have as much emphasis on children.
And yet today we are seeing that, kind of one of the main underlying purposes of the Act is to do just that, protect children from seeing harmful content online. You might be asking, well, why is this? Essentially, there have been some long-standing concerns over online harms, including the death of Molly Russell and increased harmful content circulating during the COVID-19 pandemic. And therefore, the government's aim with this act was to bring online protections in line with offline standards, particularly around safeguarding children from exposure to harmful material. And this is, again, in response to some massive public campaigns, parliamentary pressure, and perceived failings of prior legislation such as the Digital Economy Act and age verification collapses. Peter, you're nodding your head.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. That's a very concise summary of sort of the steady drumbeat that we had during the course of the decade leading up to this legislation being passed, which Ethan's quite rightly identified as being the first decade under the Cameron government and then sort of building from there. There was very much, I think, a sort of consensus, which is often the case in Parliament, of something must be done. But I mean, there were very pressing reasons why things need to be done. I mean, you can't fail to ignore the Molly Russell's father in particular was very passionate with regards to his campaigning, saying that, and there was, when it actually did then come to the inquest there were seemingly a lot of admissions made by tech platforms saying, well, we aren't responsible, but we are very, very sorry, seemed to be the outcome of that. And then sort of government took that away and thought, well, clearly we need to do something, but the what we need to do has never been necessarily clear. You've had a drumbeat saying, well, we need to regulate this content and we don't want our children to see harmful content, but that then brings you to the vexed question of, well, what is harmful? I, during about 10 years ago now, started doing regular teaching at summer law schools held by the European Law Students Association. And I ended up talking very often about things like cybersecurity, data protection, AI, technology, law tech. And very often during the course of the week, and these courses are put on by students for students, and they sort of bring in different specialists from around the world. So we'd go and present these things in Poland, Italy, wherever. And we would always say, well, let's do a workshop on regulating hate speech. But it always came down to, how do you actually define hate speech? Because what one person thinks is hate speech, someone else thinks, well, that's freedom of speech. And it's very similar when it comes to harm. How do you define harm? You might think, well, it's very clear that obviously we're looking at children accessing pornographic images, or people accessing information that is potentially could lead to self-harm and suicide and other problems. That's before we get into, in extreme cases, people actually being able to access drugs to then potentially take their lives and things, which has been a thing over the last few years. So there's always a sort of a difference of opinion on, well, what exactly is harmful content and how do you then seek to define it? Which then brings us to, I suppose, the difficulty of then trying to work out the purpose and scope behind this legislation. But it's the reason why we've ended up with a piece of legislation that took years to make its way through Parliament, a piece of legislation that has been had long discussions with regards to freedom of speech, with regards to one element of content which was called legal but harmful, that got a lot of politicians and free speech advocates very exercised before it was eventually dropped. But it means that what we actually have didn't really necessarily satisfy the campaigners, didn't really satisfy the tech companies, didn't really satisfy the advocates for greater controls and regulation in Parliament. And I think we're now starting to find doesn't really satisfy anyone. It's a fudge of massive proportions that the last government passed and the current government is trying to work out what to do with.
Ethan, did you want to come in on that?
Well, I think the important thing that this act does is it tries to bring what's unacceptable offline and make that unacceptable online. So really, it's not two discussions about what counts as hate speech online, it's also what counts as hate speech offline. There shouldn't be two separate standards for online versus offline, and I think that's what the bill tries to grapple with. And yeah.
I think it's interesting that you keep going towards the word try there. I think that's a really big focus, that the law is definitely trying and we can't fault them for trying, but certainly the execution leaves something to the imagination. So thinking about, what actually is harm, you've got two sort of categories here. You've got primary priority content, such as looking at the Act aims to tackle self-harm content, eating disorder, suicide, pornographic content. That's kind of the few headline aims. And then you've got further harm categories such as, bullying, dangerous stunts, or other high-risk material. That's all trying to be encompassed by the Act. And again, we are leading back to that word trying.
So just the way you've said that, it's just reminded me. I'm going to show my age, as is often the case here. Unfortunately, I am a little bit older than the two other people on the recording today. But I was just thinking that if I say the word jackass, I don't know if it's something that either of you will remember.
Oh no, I
Yeah,
do.
you remember that?
Yeah.
So you get these guys who would just do. I mean, you were just talking there, dangerous stunts and high risk material. Well, that's what they did.
Yeah.
Is that now cutting? However, are we talking about that falling inside our definition of harm?
Yeah.
Is that the idea of, kids might watch that and then they'll go out and attempt to go on a skateboard with a firework powering them and jump over a colleague? Who knows? It's, but is that the sort of stuff that falls within our definition? And I think that how this legislation is now echoing out, and we'll probably come to this more later in terms of the some of the issues on the ground that have been facing Ofcom in trying to regulate and enforce the legislation. But it just shows the difficult nature of how you define things here. I mean, it's interesting actually that sometimes you'll get the greatest things happen in terms of taking away a potential harm doesn't actually come through legislation. If we think back a few years ago, Amelia, we ended up doing some content for the podcast on Meta.
Yeah.
When they were coming up with the metaverse.
Yes.
Which was Mark Zuckerberg's attempt at spending billions on this virtual world that we could all go into and have virtual meetings, and you'd log in and become a headless, but not headless, you'd be a torso with no legs, basically, all floating in rooms or around tables and able to see each other. You'd see someone else as a floating torso and be able to have conversations, and you'd all be in this virtual world. And of course, a few journalists went in and suddenly realised that it was mainly full of, how can we put this, predators and underage children. And there wasn't an awful lot in between.
Pretty much.
And of course, it was entirely unregulated. Any women or children who went in there got some fairly unpleasant, would be on the receiving end of some pretty unpleasant conduct from very aggressive men. And the whole thing basically collapsed and burned. Now Zuckerberg is putting all his billions into AI, and quietly is trying to basically get us to all quietly forget the tens of billions that they spent on building the metaverse. I mean, he even rebranded, Facebook from Facebook to Meta in terms of Facebook Inc., which owns Facebook and WhatsApp and Instagram. It's called Meta in an expectation of this thing being rolled out and being phenomenally successful. Well, where did it go? And it disappeared because A, it was a breeding ground for predators, and B, it was incredibly boring in that the people who were developing it weren't even going on there and using it, which led to, why are we doing this if we ourselves don't even go on there and use it? So that's ended up not being rolled out, not through any great act of political intervention or regulation, just through them working out this is a failed concept.
So regulation is something that you've mentioned quite a few times. Ethan, do you have any thoughts in terms of regulation and how the Act is going to be regulated?
The regulations are being rolled out in a tiered approach, and one interesting thing is that the regulations defining how the qualifying worldwide revenue should be set don't come out till after the company's duties to do their fee notifications. So you'll have companies lining up to see whether they need to notify Ofcom, the regulator, of their duty to pay, but they won't know whether they've hit the threshold because the threshold hasn't been released yet. And
that's interesting. So it seems that you're almost saying, well, the regulation came out 2 years ago, and yet it's not been fully thought through. Does that pretty much not get it in a nutshell? Peter, you're laughing there.
I'll let Ian speak to that. Ethan speak to that.
I think this sums up this act and previous acts. The Digital Economies Act previously failed due to administrative errors and setbacks, and I think this act has the potential of coming to the same fate. the Digital Economies Act failed to introduce age verification laws due to a minister forgetting to inform the EU that they were creating this new act. And yeah.
I mean, that the research that you did on this, Ethan, was incredible because it pointed out, a case study in how Parliament works. So it actually passed something with the age verification requirement in it, and then couldn't get it to work because it was so poorly drafted and hadn't been properly cleared.
And so we are actually seeing age verification being used in relation to this law. You've now got specific content online that does have like a pop-up of where you have to confirm your age. And I don't just mean the ticking the box, I am over 18, jobs are good and move on. No, it means that you actually have to use some form of ID to identify yourself or another alternate means. So for example, I know some websites are using AI where they essentially take a picture of your face and they say, well, you know what, you look around 18, well done, you can view this content. Or in some cases, it's no, you're literally 6 years old, you absolutely should not be viewing this content. But you say very, well, that's all well and good until you don't necessarily get the AI to work in the way that it should. It's not 100% accurate.
No. And indeed, sometimes not particularly secure either. So what effect this is showing is the legislation is saying we want these platforms to demonstrate compliance, to show that they are taking steps to ensure that children, underage users, are not accessing content. So it's then down to the platform to demonstrate compliance with that requirement. One way is to, as Amelia said, introduce, sort of directly have those age verification steps. Another way of doing it is through having a sort of over-the-top platform. So there are certain platforms like, say, Yoti, which is an ID platform. The idea is that you can use that to verify who you are, and then the platform you're trying to access, rather than you having to give it, your passport and your image and a likeness, all this stuff, it will connect to Yoti and confirm from your profile on there that you are who you say you are, and then confirm that you can view the content. At least then you aren't running the risk of said adult platform being hacked and your ID being hacked and displayed, as well as the fact that you are then a user of said platform, which no one's really going to want to have to admit to. But so
that's sort of the problem, because there is no one size fits all for these platforms. So it's not just the UK government saying, well, actually, you all have to use Yoti for this process. No, each platform can choose how they comply with this regulation, which is where you've got kind of diversification in how they do that. And that's where you've got, potentially insecure platforms being used, where you don't know where your data is being squirreled away to, which is where we get kind of towards the loophole in this, because obviously if you've got, this is a UK-based act, whereas it's not affecting the rest of the world per se. So if you, in theory, use a VPN, you can circumvent the age verification rules because you appear to be from a different country. And I feel like this is one of the main headlines from the news, is the fact that, VPNs have been hitting the top app charts because so many people have been using a VPN to circumvent this.
Is it something like an 1,800% increase in downloading of VPNs by UK users?
I think 5 of the 10 apps that are free are all VPNs as well. So it's mainly free VPNs that are being used as well, which come into question the kind of safety of these VPNs and what they're doing with your information, which are the same issues people have with the age verification tools as well. All of which, not all of which, but a majority of which were developed for the Digital Economies Act, which was then scrapped because of safety concerns, and now we're using them, and the government expects us to think that they're safe enough for us now.
Indeed, and it's the fact then that we are very much in the world where they're wanting to sort of go ahead with this en masse. We're now seeing you could say it's an unintended consequence, but government was warned numerous times that this was going to happen. that you were going to get, particularly, internet savvy teenagers. Guess what? They're going to know that they can go and download a VPN before the majority of adults. Indeed, they probably were using a VPN in the first place. The other unintended consequence is that if people are using free VPNs, there's no such thing in the world as free. Therefore, a lot of those free platforms, these free VPNs, will then be taking user data from the mobile device that said VPN has been installed on as the sort of price of admission, to allow the user to then get onto the platform they're wanting to view. So they could be giving away access to their phones, their text messages, their emails, their browser history. And some people may say, so what? But think about how integral mobile devices are now to the majority of people who use them. And therefore, you're in effect giving away the sort of keys to your life in terms of what you're using your mobile device for, all of that content, all of that analytic data. So it's actually opened up users who are then using these free apps to an additional massive risk. Arguably one that you could say might be even greater than the one that we were originally trying to close down in terms of kids accessing this stuff in the first place.
So we've looked at sort of what platforms are doing to comply, i.e. using age verification. But what actually are Ofcom's powers to then regulate this? Ethan?
So Ofcom has a wide variety of enforcement powers. Firstly, if they think you are failing to comply with your duties, they can issue a provisional notice of contravention and give you time to respond with representations about why you think you might not have done. And then they will confirm the decision, and then they'll lead into either court action or penalties. So they have the power to do service restriction orders or access restriction orders, which will greatly limit the business capabilities of websites. And then in terms of fines, it's 10% of the qualifying worldwide revenue, or up to 18 million. So you can see how this act is very targeted at the large companies like Meta.
Indeed, those amounts, when it comes to that qualifying worldwide revenue, QWR, could be potentially eye-watering. And that's one of the reasons why we have at least seen significant steps made by platforms to demonstrate that they are complying with the requirements of the legislation. However, it's probably not necessarily the action that was intended when the legislation was being introduced. So, for example, on Twitter, on X, content is being taken down or put out of use for UK users. But for example, one high profile example of this is a speech by a Conservative MP on the allegations with regards to child sexual abuse and grooming gangs. This MP made a very impassioned speech in the House of Commons. It was, of course, clipped up and put out on social media. And X has then had to remove content of that speech because, of course, the stuff it refers to falls inside our broad definition of harm.
And yet it's actually being used for informational purposes.
Yes, and therefore is meaning that content is being restricted when of course, the original intention of the legislation wasn't that you take down, a video of someone in the House of Commons talking about issues around child sexual abuse.
No.
But that's what's happening. Wikipedia had similar problems. Reddit has had similar problems. But when I say problems, it's the fact that, if anything, because of the size of that potential fine, the 10% of qualifying worldwide revenue, they're therefore wanting to get on the front foot and saying, no, we don't want to be on the end of an investigation or enforcement. We'll just take this content down and we'll answer questions later. But of course, that leads to a massive allegation that all the legislation is doing is actually chilling freedom of speech.
Yeah, that's an interesting point to mention. I think it's something that we're going to keep seeing happening, because I think we covered earlier this year in a podcast mention of, I think it was something about hamsters, like a really
Yeah.
nice kind of informational post about hamsters. I can't quite remember why this fell under that broad harmful definition. But essentially, yeah, this is just, some very normal person And unfortunately, because he couldn't quite comply with the regulations, he just had to take a
Well,
page down.
I think in that instance, it was legislation requiring the moderation of content on user
Yes.
forums. So on a user forum that's just run by, say, a volunteer or volunteers, do they necessarily have the time to be able to go ahead and review all individual comments before they might be put onto below a blog post? No, they didn't. So they said, look, we can't, as a volunteer, something that's being done in spare time, we cannot justify having teams of moderators and looking at every single content and then assessing that comment against a list of criteria is simply too onerous. So I'm sorry, we're going to have to close down our valued blog on things to feed your hamster, and tips to get it through winter and all this stuff. Meant that had to go because they couldn't comply with those broader content moderation requirements. Again, showing a government would say, oh, well, this was an unintended consequence. Well, no, you were told this was going to happen, but you just chose not to believe it, and then it did happen.
So we focus a lot on platforms and adult content, but actually under the Act, there are some updated/new offences. So we've got the false communications, which is an offence where sending knowingly false information intending serious harm, and that replaces part of the Malicious Communications Act 1988. You've got threatening communications, threats of death or serious harm. You've got cyber flashing, which is sending sexual images with intent to distress or for sexual gratification. You've got encouraging or assisting serious self-harm with up to 5 years imprisonment. You've got flashing images targeting epilepsy sufferers, also known as Zach's Law. And you've got sharing or threatening to send intimate images, which again has up to 5 years imprisonment. So you've got a lot of new offences. Ethan, did you want to cover these in some more detail?
Okay, so I think it's interesting that they include this term non-trivial psychological harm, because what is that? It's not actually defined in the Act. With a lot of the other terms, they're all defined out. However, this one isn't, and I think that gives the Secretary of State a wide purchase to regulate how they define this, and it opens the offence up to a lot of unintended messages that are posted on Twitter. And I believe, Peter, you have an example of this with the bombing airport joke that I made.
Yes. Yeah. So that originally was going back almost 10 years now, or more than 10 years. So there was a case in the early days of Twitter when an individual sent a tweet threatening to blow up Doncaster Airport. Basically, they said, Doncaster Airport's closed again because of the snow. Sort it out or I'll blow it up. Basically saying because they were wanting to fly out of there the following week. I mean, it's obviously just a sort of off the cuff, frustration. Oh, I'm annoyed about this. Some 6 months after that tweet was sent, someone at the airport saw it, reported it. Police turned up at this individual's home, and they were then arrested and charged and convicted of an offence under the Communications Act 2003. When you look at the judgment that was made at that time, that seemed very much to be made on the basis that the judge talked about a Twitter message. I don't think they necessarily understood, am I going back here to sort of the dark days of 2011, 2012, I don't think they necessarily understood the idea of a post, and that post then being visible by others. The principle of, if Twitter is basically the idea of you stand on the roof of a building with a megaphone and you say something, and some people might hear you and others might not, but it's up there. As opposed to a message which suggests, for example, a phone call, and you pick up the phone and you say something to someone else. I think the judge at first instance sort of heard this and made it sound like it was something akin to like the coded bomb threats that the IRA used to do in the 1980s. And that, of course, was a misapplication. So this ended up going all the way to the Court of Appeal. At that appeal hearing, there was the individual who'd said this and been convicted was supported by both Al Murray, the comedian, and Stephen Fry, who both were very agitated about the issues this raised from a freedom of speech perspective, saying, look, we like to test out as comedians some of our acts on social media, and potentially by this conviction is saying that no, you can't do that, that you don't have the ability to say something that is a joke or satirical. So on that occasion, the conviction was quashed. The individual, who I think was an accountant at the time, and therefore it had a significant impact on their career. If you get a conviction under the Communications Act, that was a sort of a life-changing penalty that they had faced. So that kind of showed the early times that this had become an issue with regards to what is a threatening or a false communication. And therefore, the attempt here was to sort of turn around and update some of these offences for the 2020s. However, the fact is, of course, that then means that, for example, threatening communication, to a certain extent, you're then conflicting with what was in the original Communications Act 2003. One of the other points here is it talks about sharing and threatening to share intimate images. Well, that's something that was already illegal. We had the high-profile example in the UK just within the last few years of the newsreader, Hugh Edwards. What was it he'd been doing some rather unpleasant things in terms of paying an individual to supply indecent material. Ethically was problematic, but there was nothing legally wrong with it. What was legally wrong was that then the police started looking more deeply at what he'd been doing, and he had shared content with another individual. And even though that content had been sent by the individual to Hugh Edwards, and he then went back and said, "Do not share this with me again," that was enough for the police to say, well, you've shared this, and that's what we're convicting you of. So when he appeared at, I think, Bow Magistrates earlier this year, that's what he was being convicted of, was the sharing of those intimate images. So that already was an offence. We're just adding to it with this. But the risk is when you do that, sometimes it's then no longer as clear cut for the police in terms of what they're actually arresting you for and charging you with. And indeed can sometimes make it more difficult for the CPS to then actually make the charge stick. So you can get that unintended consequence as well.
So you've led us very nicely on to thinking about consequences. Thinking about criticism and implementation challenges, you already discussed VPN use to essentially circumvent some of the age verification access controls. There's also a few other kind of challenges that we've seen in the news. Ethan, did you want to take us through some of those?
So, recently in the past couple of days, we've seen Wikipedia lose its High Court case for its categorization as a Category 1 service. Being placed in a Category 1 service, whilst it hasn't been yet, if Ofcom does then decide to place it in a Category 1 service, it will be subject to the most rigorous and demanding duties of any of the services. And this is purely down to the wide reach that Wikipedia has due to the high volume of users. And if it were to be classified as a Category 1, Wikipedia have said they would have to basically limit the amount of users in the UK that could interact with the website. But during the judge's comments, he did say that if Ofcom did do this and categorise it as a Category 1 service, they would have to explain how it fits proportionally with Wikipedia's use as a website and how it would protect the freedom of expression in Wikipedia. So it's not all's not lost for Wikipedia. There will be protections put in place for them, and yeah.
I think an interesting part of the conversation that we had last week was thinking about how if you are under the age of 18, you cannot buy alcohol without proof of ID. And as you'll likely know, this is not always a process that works well, because you do get kind of leeway either side in terms of sometimes, most people have heard of the term fake IDs, and some of them do work. Then you've got the flip side of people being ID'd despite being well over the age of 18. I will include myself under that umbrella. And but we still do use that. So you can always compare the age verification for alcohol almost with this, because it's not a completely infallible process, but it does attempt to manage the risk. Peter.
It does, but it's interesting actually as technology has become more a part of daily life. I mean, how many of us, when you're now trying to say you've gone along to a Tesco or whatever, Express and you just want to get a bag with a few things in, but one of the things in that bag could be a bottle of wine. And there's no one actually, either there's a big queue for the one till that's got a human being behind it. So you go to the machine and then that will flash red until a human being has to come and confirm that you are an adult and over the age of 18. So it used to be the whole, well, you just have to prove to the man in the shop, yes, I'm over 18, yes, you can buy something from your off license. But, that's what the legislation was originally designed for, not thinking of the ubiquity now we have mini supermarkets on every street corner.
Yeah.
But a degree of automation they've attempted to introduce to make the process as frictionless as possible is then actually frustrated by the need to prove that you are over the age of 18.
Yeah.
Or in your instance, where it turns around and they say, sorry, we aren't convinced you're over the age of 18, and you then have to go home and get your ID and go, I think you'll find that I am.
Yes, that's always an interesting one. But at least it does show that you do have a balance of, sometimes it does work, sometimes it doesn't. But I think the point is the fact that we do still use this legislation to stop selling alcohol to minors, essentially. And it is not infallible. And I think that's what we're doing here, is that in regulating this content with the age verification, it's not infallible. It's just meant to try and stop some people. And I think it is sort of doing that.
I think you'd want to be able to turn around and say, in the way that you think, okay, the over 18 check works for the majority of instances where you could otherwise have had alcohol being sold to under 18s.
Yeah.
You would want to turn around and say, we are satisfied that despite its imperfections, this measure in terms of the Online Safety Act is having the desired effect of minimising the consumption of harmful material by children in a majority of instances.
Yeah.
Now, we're going to have to wait and see until we get more detailed data in the months and years that follow, whether that really is the case.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting, actually. I was just thinking of the implications here when we're just talking about Wikipedia and the fact that they may limit access to Wikipedia. Now, Wikipedia isn't 100% fallible. It's not a work of, it says it's on Wikipedia, so it must be true. In the same way that the Sun newspaper isn't exactly the world's most reliable index of news that's happening on a daily basis. You still have to sort of engage brain and sometimes take things with a pinch of salt. But nonetheless, when you're currently undertaking a Google search, it's become the case that depending what it is you're searching for, sometimes the first thing that comes up, say you've searched for an individual, what would come up would be, here are several different individuals, and then probably the individual that it thinks you're referring to, and then it'll give you a few options, and then the text from Wikipedia will come up. So I wonder if limiting Wikipedia's use would then limit the number of times that Wikipedia content and links would appear in search results. You might think, well, so what? But in search results now, don't forget that on Google, it's changed. Because now, of course, the first thing that comes up is that little box with blue text in it. That blue box isn't from Wikipedia. That is Google's own AI engine, Gemini.
Yes.
Yeah.
Telling you what it thinks you want to know as a result of your search. And the really scary thing about that is, says who? Because it used to be the case that you'd do your search and you'd get, first of all, perhaps something from Wikipedia, and then you might get a few sponsored ads of content or links before you then got through to genuine internet content. You might have to look at a few sites to then get the thing that you were looking for, be it a product, service, knowledge, content, research, whatever it may be. And that's now no longer the case. The first thing that comes up is now a box from Gemini where it's giving you what it thinks you want to know. But bear in mind, and we've already said, probably talked on this podcast enough before about issues around AI, potential hallucination, also the fact that it's not necessarily entirely secure in terms of where that data goes, what's it used for, blah, blah, blah. So already you've got your online search experience is being changed from the presence of Gemini giving you something on AI. And then do we have the Online Safety Act then actually minimizing links to things like Wikipedia and other sources that could actually serve to put you on the straight and narrow? I just toss that opinion out there for, feel free to get in touch and say you disagree with me. But I think that we're seeing fundamentally here the way that we've developed the idea of online search over the last 30 years is changing quite radically here in terms of what comes up. Your genuine links are a lot further down the page. You're getting that blue box, and then even links from the Online Safety Act, links to things like Wikipedia and others, could be heavily minimised as a result of this chilling effect of they're worried about these massive fines.
I'd be interested, because it's not something we've spoken about, and it's not something I've directly seen anything about, how the use of age verification processing could be used in relation to AI. Because currently, can't say that, during personal use of ChatGPT, anything has come up to say, can you prove your age before I answer your question? And in theory, you could ask ChatGPT to look up or summarize harmful content. And this is kind of another rabbit hole we could probably go down. But I certainly think, with Gemini in mind, could Gemini as an AI not fully understand that you need to verify to be able to see some of this online harmful content and just summarize it for you there and then? Because we're not just talking about pornographic images, we're talking about other harmful content. Ethan, you tried to come in there.
Sorry. Well, ChatGPT isn't user-to-user generated, is it? So it's generated by the AI, so it wouldn't be captured under these regulations, which is very interesting. But I think also people are coming away, I know especially younger people, are coming away from standard search engines and moving towards TikTok. I know a lot of people on their daily searches will just open up apps like TikTok and search in there. And the regulations affect apps like TikTok the most. So the method with which people are getting their information is being the most regulated. And I think that's a very interesting consequence of this act.
Sorry, I've just got my head in my hands thinking of people's first port of call in terms of, I've got a problem, I'd like to know the answer. I know, I'll see what an influencer on TikTok tells me.
Yeah. I think going back to your point there about user-to-user regulated content is interesting, because I think it shows how the process of managing to get this act over the line has really taken its toll, and therefore it's taken such a long period of time to get it to where it is today that it's almost already outdated. We've got AI now, we've got the EU AI Act. The UK, we've decided to kind of take a different route and use regulation that already exists. But you've just literally flagged the fact that this regulation exists and yet does not regulate AI appropriately. So perhaps a sort of gap there that was not necessarily intended, that has already come up.
Yes, and you've also actually just flagged up as well the danger here that people may end up going to large language models, Claude, Gemini, ChatGPT, and saying, how do I comply with what is harmful content? How do I comply with the requirements for this?
Yeah.
And this is already the trap that an awful lot of people are falling into, whereby they'll go and ask these questions of large language models. And of course, the large language model doesn't know and conflates UK law with EU law and US law. I'm noticing already an increase in people who get in touch and they're babbling on about, I want my content taken down. I've already done a takedown notice under the DMCA, and the DMCA is a Digital Millennium Copyright Act. Guess what? That doesn't apply in the UK because it's a piece of US legislation. So that might get you so far on a US platform, but if you are a UK user, you're looking to utilize UK rights, and you're getting in touch with a law firm based in England and Wales, which we are, prattling on about the Digital Millennium Copyright Act isn't going to get you anywhere.
Yeah.
Isn't part of your UK statutory rights. So we're already getting this conflation. And I think it's coming from people relying on, whichever large language model, or perhaps TikTok. Who knows?
Looking to the future, Ethan, do you want to take us through some of the up and coming regulations? I know that we mentioned some of these at the top of this podcast.
Okay, so the next regulation to come into force would be coming into force on the 3rd of November, and that is reporting incidences of offences regarding children to the National Crime Agency. And then after that, we have the fee notifications coming in on the 14th of September. Sorry, I've got those the wrong way round. Fee notifications come in before the content reporting. And then the super complaints regulations, which is a part of the Ofcom's Horizon scanning procedures, where they're looking for systemic faults in the regulations. And so that is organisations that can then contact Ofcom with any reports of public discussions on online safety and so on.
Can I put you on the spot there, Ethan? Just like, have you got an example of what an eligible independent body would be? An example of one, or just what their definition is broadly?
So it must be a body representing the internet. It must be a body able to act independently in its governance from regulated services. So say if TikTok were to set up an independent body, they would have to have independent governance structures.
Okay.
And the entity must contribute routinely as an expert to public discussions about online safety. And the entity must be able to be relied upon and have due regard to any guidance published by Ofcom.
Right. So we could be looking at, say, pressure groups.
Yes,
and campaigns, in other words.
To...
So we're saying that from the 31st December, from next year, those bodies will then be able to turn around, and rather than it being complaints made by any individuals, we're saying these organisations can then submit super complaints. In fact, super injunctions, now we get super complaints as well.
Or just to be facetious, I'd love to see if they did a super complaint about the Act not doing what it should have done.
Is it a bird? Is it a plane? No, it's a super complaint.
Precisely. And I think it'd be interesting to watch and see, what, if anything, comes from these up and coming regulations, because obviously we know that it's not the work of a moment to get things passed and get things through. And what it actually looks like on the other side is not always what you think it could.
No.
As Peter just said, is it a bird? Is it a plane? No, it's a super complaint.
And you can guarantee there will be some organisations that will already have got their complaints drafted and they'll be ready to go to basically hit send on the 1st of January. You can see that one coming a mile off.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and then as you quite rightly pointed out there as well, even the fee notifications. So that's going to be the thing that the tech companies are worried about, because this is then with regards to how those qualifying worldwide revenue reporting will be undertaken, how they're going to take those calculations when it comes to the size and implementation of these potential fines. And that's the reason why, as I say, we're already getting them wanting to demonstrate their compliance, so they're hopefully, in their view, minimising the risk of being clobbered by a massive fine under the once the QWR methodology has been worked out.
Very interesting.
Broadest possible sense of the word, yeah.
Do either of you have anything to add before we sort of draw this podcast to a close?
Well, as usual, I find myself thinking, have we ended up going a little bit down the too negative rabbit hole? And can we be positive? Let's try and find something positive to say about the Online Safety Act.
Wow, that's a very loud silence.
Dear, oh dear. I suppose it comes back to, if nothing else, it's that idea of, well, it's like the introduction of the no alcohol for under 18s to be sold. It's the introduction that it's established, it's drawing a line and saying this is what we expect.
And it's trying. Going back to the word we looked at the beginning, it's very Indeed. Trying.
Very trying.
Ethan, do you have anything to add?
Well, apart from that, it's trying. I think one of the positives is we have seen a reduction in porn viewage data in the UK. However, this could be put down to VPNs skewing the data. But I think at the end of the day, as long as we're reducing the amount that children are accessing these harmful content online, that is a benefit to this act. However, has that come at the cost of freedom of expression and an overburden on companies such as Wikipedia? That is still to be seen, because we're getting regulations still being released and Ofcom are still realising their duties as the regulator.
I think that brings us very nicely to a close.
I think it
So
does.
that was our last discussion of the episode. And if you have any questions about what we've talked about today, please email our admin@digitallawuk.com. A summary of today's stories and stories that we've looked at in relation to this are available on our website, as well as links to the original stories containing more information. And if you'd like to hear more from us, including information about subscriber-only podcasts, webinars, and events, then please subscribe to Premium via our Patreon channel using the link in the show notes. And I'd also like to mention as well that we have Anson Evaluate have a Substack, and the link to that will also be in our show notes, where you can find more information about cybersecurity and cyber-related issues. A big thank you to Anson Evaluate for helping to produce this podcast. And if you'd be interested to hear more about Anson Evaluate services, please take a look at our website that you can find at www.ansonevaluate.com. Just a reminder, these episodes are available on our website, YouTube channel, and podcast channels as well, such as Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon, essentially anywhere you can find a podcast. And please feel free to leave a review. And as a final thank you to Ethan for being a special guest on our podcast today and for basically doing a lot of the underhand research for us. So thank you again, and we hope to see you all next week.